My name is Erin Hale, and for a period of time I lived in the small guest house behind my parents' home. It was a simple space, quiet and separate, which allowed me to steady myself after a difficult stretch of life. I kept my belongings organized and handled my own needs because I wanted to prove that I could be responsible for myself, even while staying close to family. I reminded myself every day that this arrangement was temporary, a pause before I stepped forward again. That changed on an afternoon when my older sister entered without knocking. She stopped in the center of the room and looked around with an expression that suggested she was already imagining where her own things would be placed, as if my presence were merely temporary clutter. She told me she intended to move into the guest house so she could restart her life, speaking as though my stability and effort held no weight at all. I waited for her to offer a reason, an explanation, or even a hint of understanding, yet there was nothing. The following day, my parents spoke to me with firm, settled voices, leaving no space to respond. My father delivered the line that has stayed with me ever since: "This is our house. If you don't like it, leave." What they did not anticipate was the shift that followed, a shift that altered the balance in our family in a way none of us could have predicted. The moment I stepped away from that house marked the beginning of something they never expected. Before I continue, tell me what time it is where you are and which city you are watching from, so I can understand how far this story has traveled and who is listening on the other side of the screen. A few weeks before everything shifted, life in the Hale household still appeared steady from the outside, though those of us within it understood that the balance had been fragile for years. Our home sat in a quiet suburban neighborhood in Denver, a place where neighbors waved politely, lawns were trimmed nearly the same length, and every house looked similar enough that you might forget which driveway led to your own. Inside that house, however, the atmosphere always carried a subtle tension, a sense that certain words could not be said and certain truths could not be acknowledged without upsetting something that had held our family together only on the surface. I had moved out shortly after finishing school, determined to build a life independent from my family's complex emotional dynamics, and for a while I succeeded. I shared a small apartment with a coworker, worked shifts that kept me up late, and paid my rent on time even when money was tight. It was not glamorous, but it was mine, and I took pride in holding it together with my own hands. That changed when the company I worked for downsized, eliminating my position with a brief apology that did little to soften the blow. I searched for new work, sent out resumes every day, and took on temporary jobs while trying to keep up with rent. Yet the numbers eventually refused to stretch any further, pushing me back to my parents' home, even though I felt a deep hesitation about returning to an environment where the past had never been resolved. My sister Riley had always been the one who captured attention effortlessly, not because of accomplishments or discipline, but because she knew how to speak in a way that sounded confident and decisive, even when she had no real plan behind her words. She could walk into a room, offer a story about a new idea or an opportunity she claimed to be considering, and people would lean in believing she was on the verge of something impressive. My mother, Patricia, encouraged that version of her, praising Riley's confidence as if it were evidence of strength, while quietly dismissing my steadier, quieter progress as something less remarkable. Patricia's way of shaping the emotional climate of our home was gentle but powerful, using tone and timing rather than outright statements so that fairness slowly eroded while seeming to remain intact, and I often found myself questioning whether my own perceptions were unreasonable. My father, Daniel, rarely intervened in any conflict, choosing silence as his form of peacekeeping, though that silence carried its own weight, leaving me to navigate my feelings without support or validation. His reluctance to choose a side was presented as a desire to avoid conflict, yet the effect was that Riley's wants were always granted while mine were expected to adapt, yield, or disappear. I learned to swallow frustration, to move around the emotional space that Riley occupied, and to remain composed, because I believed losing my temper would only reinforce the narrative that I was the one causing tension. The longer I stayed in the guest house, the more clearly I began to recognize how deeply those patterns were embedded in our home, how effortless it was for everyone to assume that I would be the one to bend whenever a choice had to be made. Even then, before anything had been said aloud, I could feel that something was approaching, something that would demand I either continue to shrink myself to maintain the peace, or finally refuse to do so. I did not yet know which choice I would make, only that the quiet before the storm never lasted long in our family. A few days later, the four of us sat down for dinner as if it were any other evening, though something quiet and unnerving curled beneath that stillness. The table was set the same way as always, the familiar plates, and the faint scent of roasted vegetables. Yet everything felt slightly off, as if the room itself knew what was about to be said before I did. I tried to steady my breath and pretend that this was just another meal we had shared countless times before. It began when Riley placed her fork down with careful precision and leaned back slightly, her posture relaxed in a way that suggested she had rehearsed this moment. Her voice carried an ease that came from certainty rather than confidence. She said she had been thinking about the guest house, explaining that she needed a place where she could restructure her life, regain a sense of balance, and create new routines without distractions. Each word was delivered with an air of reasonableness that left no room for questioning, as if the conclusion had already been reached, and all that remained was the announcement. Patricia responded with a small nod, almost gentle, though the meaning was unmistakably firm. She commented that the guest house had been helpful for me when I needed space, and now it could offer the same benefit to someone else. Her tone carried no hostility, yet it held something far more permanent. It suggested that decisions were being made in quiet hallways long before I ever arrived at the table. It suggested that my presence there had an expiration date that everyone knew but me. Daniel remained silent, his gaze fixed on his plate. His stillness created a sharp contrast with Riley's calm assertiveness and Patricia's approving tone. Silence often speaks louder than disagreement. In this case, it shaped the entire dynamic. By not speaking, he allowed the shift to occur, and his passive presence made the imbalance complete. I felt the weight of that silence settle into my chest like a stone. I chose my words with care. I asked whether this discussion included me, whether my needs were being considered as well. Riley smiled with a softness that felt dismissive rather than kind, as though acknowledgement was a courtesy rather than a necessity. She replied that everyone deserved stability and that I had already had my turn. The phrasing was so casual and smooth that it took a moment for the meaning to fully land. After dinner, Riley walked into the backyard with a purposeful stride. She approached the guest house not as a visitor, but as someone assessing a property she believed she already possessed. She studied the windows, the porch steps, the small planter beside the door. There was no glance in my direction, no pause to ask how I felt. The unspoken message was unmistakable. The space was hers, and my presence there was temporary in a way that now felt unavoidably real. I watched from a short distance, observing each movement and expression, realizing that something inside the family had already shifted long before this moment. The guest house had once felt like a fragile sanctuary, but now it felt like borrowed time counting down to displacement. I could sense how easily I could be removed, not through confrontation, but through decisions layered beneath politeness. When night fell, the house seemed quieter than usual, though nothing physical had changed. The stillness was different. It was the kind that settles in after something has begun moving slowly, inevitably toward a destination no one wants to name. I did not say anything. I simply lay awake, aware of a storm forming just beyond the edge of what I could see. The following weekend arrived with a kind of quiet anticipation that I could feel before anyone said a word. The air in the house felt different, not in an obvious way, but in the way people walk a little slower or speak a little softer when they know something has shifted. I tried to tell myself that the unease was only in my imagination, yet the morning unfolded in ways that proved otherwise. I was in the kitchen when I heard the sound of keys being placed on the counter, followed by the low murmur of conversation between Mom and a locksmith. The realization did not hit all at once. It arrived gradually as I watched the locksmith remove the old lock on the front door and replace it with a new one while Mom stood nearby offering small comments and nods. She did not look in my direction, though she surely knew I was watching. There was no explanation offered and none needed. The new lock was not about safety. It was a symbol, a boundary being drawn in metal and silence. I told myself that perhaps I was reading too much into it until I saw Riley later that afternoon. She was walking through the yard with a couple I did not recognize. They followed her toward the guest house, listening attentively, as she pointed out the small windows, the patio, and the view toward the backyard garden. Her voice carried an almost professional enthusiasm describing possibilities for furnishing storage, and even how the lighting looked at sunrise. It sounded like a real estate tour, which would have made sense if the place were hers to offer. But it wasn't. Not yet. Not officially. Yet the situation suggested that everyone but me already considered the transition a done deal. I remained out of sight, not hiding but observing from enough distance to create a thin layer of insulation. The couple nodded politely as Riley spoke, and there was laughter at one point, the kind that comes easily when people are trying to show goodwill. I felt something tighten in my chest. I was watching someone walk through the space where I slept, where I made coffee in the morning, where I folded my laundry and tried to rebuild my confidence. Yet to them, it was an empty opportunity, a room waiting to be claimed. Later that day, I went into the house to grab a few things, and that was when I heard them. Mom and Riley were discussing future plans in the living room, unaware that I was close enough to hear. Their voices were calm, almost matter-of-fact, as they spoke about how the guest house would be the first step in reorganizing the property, and how eventually, the main house would need adjustments too. Then came the part that truly stung. They spoke about me not as someone present or deserving of inclusion, but as a temporary complication that would resolve itself once I found somewhere else to go. Mom said she assumed I would figure things out soon, and Riley responded that giving me too much time would slow the progress. I stood there long enough to feel the weight of it settle fully. There was no benefiting from denial now. The decision had already been made. The new lock, the house tour, the casual phrasing of my absence as an expected outcome. Each piece fit together with painful clarity. I did not confront them. Something inside me recognized that the conversation was no longer mine to enter. Instead, I walked back toward the guest house, slowly taking in every detail as though I were already remembering it. The railing beneath my hand, the small crack in the walkway, the curtain that never quite hung straight. These were pieces of a life built in transition, now approaching its end. One afternoon, I returned to the property with the thought that I might finish sorting the last of my things at my own pace, believing I still had a bit of time to decide when to actually leave. Yet the moment the driveway came into view, I stopped. Cardboard boxes sat near the edge of the lawn, arranged in uneven stacks. Some had been sealed, while others remained open, revealing folded clothes, books, small personal items placed inside with varying degrees of care. A few pieces that did not fit inside lay beside them, exposed to the afternoon air. My belongings had been gathered without me. The gesture itself carried a finality I had not yet spoken aloud, though it had been forming around me for days. Riley stood near the boxes, her posture steady, not triumphant, and not apologetic. There was no pretense of surprise at my arrival. Her expression suggested that everything occurring was obvious, expected, and already decided. A short distance away, Mom observed silently. She did not step forward to explain, nor to soften what was unfolding. There were no raised voices, no moment of conflict or questioning. The quiet between us was sharp, precise, leaving nothing ambiguous. I approached slowly, though not to confront. I simply needed to arrive within myself enough to understand what I was seeing. Riley told me the boxes were ready, and that it would be easier to move everything while the weather remained clear. Her tone did not attempt reassurance or justification. It was simply a statement of what had been done. Mom did not add anything. She remained there, fully present yet unreachable. I wanted to ask for a reason, though every piece of reasoning had already been shown through action during the past days: the new lock on the front door, the tour of the guest house given to strangers, the conversation about reorganizing the property that framed me as someone who would, of course, leave soon. Words would not change the truth that stood in front of me. I realized that speaking would only create the illusion that something unresolved remained, so I nodded. The motion felt heavy, as though it required more strength than lifting any box could. I picked up one of the boxes. My hands did not shake, although something inside me shifted with a tremor that did not belong to the body. Riley stepped aside. Mom looked at me for a moment longer before turning away and walking back toward the house. Riley followed. The door closed behind them without sound. I stood there beneath the open sky, surrounded by the faint hum of the neighborhood, feeling how complete the separation had become. I loaded the boxes into my car one at a time. When I finished, I sat in the driver's seat with my hands resting lightly on the wheel, not turning the key. The air inside the car felt still, as though holding everything I could not yet release. Eventually, I drove. I do not remember much of the route, only the steady motion of the road. I arrived at the apartment of my closest friend, Dana Morales, the person who had remained steady through the shifting years of my life, someone who understood me without requiring explanations. She opened the door before I had finished knocking, her expression shifting instantly in recognition of something deeper than fatigue. She placed a glass of water on the table and sat down near me, not too close, not far away, allowing space without leaving me alone. The silence in her home felt different from the silence I had left behind. It held room for breath. It allowed time to settle without pressure or expectation. That night, I understood fully that I had left more than a place. I had left the version of myself that waited to be welcomed. At the beginning of the next month, I found myself in a small neighborhood laundromat, where the hum of machines and the scent of detergent clung to the air like something familiar yet distant. I had gone there seeking work, any work, because my savings were thin and my options even thinner. I knew how to do laundry well, not only because I had lived alone during college, but because of a woman I used to work under during my previous job. Her name was Mrs. Alvarez, an older manager with silver-streaked hair and a voice that never rose above a steady, firm tone. She had taught me more than how to remove stains or fold dress shirts. She taught me how to treat tasks with dignity even when no one was watching. I remembered her words as I approached the owner of the laundromat and asked if he needed help with washing, pressing, or organizing orders. The owner hesitated, not because he doubted my ability, but because he did not yet know me. So I offered to take on the backlog of laundry waiting in the corner, a pile that looked larger than anything I had handled before. I worked quietly, carefully paying attention to water temperature, detergent, balance, fabric texture, and the slow rhythm of my movements. When I finished, the owner said nothing at first. He only looked at the shirts, the dresses, the sheets, then nodded once. That nod became my first step forward. I started taking on small freelance work from customers who preferred their clothes washed by hand or cared for more delicately. The jobs paid modestly, but they paid consistently. I rented a tiny room in a boarding house near the laundromat, a place just big enough for a bed, a table, and a shelf, where I folded my clothes with deliberate method, as if tidiness could stand in for reassurance. The room had thin walls, and I could hear the occasional footsteps or soft conversations of neighbors, yet it was quiet enough to let me hear myself think something I had not realized I had been missing. I kept to a routine mornings at the laundromat, afternoons, picking up or delivering clothes to clients, evenings cleaning my room, or preparing for the next day. I bought groceries in small amounts, learned which bus routes arrived on time, and found a certain steadiness in the repetition of each weekday. It was not a triumphant return to independence, nor was it a dramatic reversal of what had been taken from me. It was simply living step by step without asking anyone for permission. I did not feel healed, not yet, but the ground beneath me no longer felt like it was giving way. Early the following month, I found a small studio apartment on the east side of town. It was not large, and it certainly was not luxurious yet. It was the first place in a long time that felt like it belonged to me. The walls were a muted cream, the floors were scuffed in places where furniture had been dragged for years, and there was a single window facing the street. When I stood inside it for the first time with my bag still zipped shut at my feet, I felt something loosen in my chest, as if I had been holding my breath for far too long without noticing. I spent the first days cleaning every corner. I scrubbed the kitchenette until the counters felt smooth beneath my hands, washed the windows to let in more light, and arranged my few belongings, carefully making sure everything had a place. There was no hurry, no one timing how long I took, or asking why I was doing something a particular way. It was just me shaping my environment slowly, deliberately, with a sense of steadiness that I had not felt in years. When I hung the first small print on the wall, a simple watercolor of a field at dusk, the room shifted from temporary shelter to a beginning. The studio became my world. I thrifted blankets in warm colors, chose a lamp with soft yellow light, and laid down a small rug near the foot of my bed, giving the space a quiet warmth. I wanted it to feel like a place where a person could breathe without bracing for someone else's judgment. Every time I stepped inside after work, I closed the door gently behind me and felt the silence wrap around me like a second skin. During this time, I stopped reaching out to my family. I did not block numbers or delete contacts. I simply went quiet. It was not an act of rebellion or punishment. It was the first boundary I had ever drawn with both hands steady. I no longer needed to justify where I was, what I was doing, or how I planned my days. The absence of their voices in my life was both freeing and disorienting. There were evenings when I sat on the edge of my bed and felt a hollow ache settle beneath my ribs, an ache shaped like the family I had once believed I was a part of. Yet even in that ache, there was clarity. I had not told them I was safe. I had not told them I was gone. I let the silence speak because for once it was their turn to notice. Riley claimed the ADU. Patricia made her decisions in her usual final tone. Daniel remained quiet in whatever room he occupied. The house that once held my footsteps continued existing without me, and I no longer tried to imagine my place inside it. In my studio, mornings began slowly. I would wake to the pale, early light filtering through the window, make coffee in the small pot I'd bought secondhand, and sit on the floor to drink it. There was no one to ask me questions, no expectation to fill silence with conversation, no need to perform or explain. Sometimes I felt the loneliness as a sharp pulse beneath the calm. Other times I felt the peace as something heavy and grounding, an anchor that kept me steady. Freedom, I learned, is not always joyous. Sometimes it is quiet, tender, and aching. Sometimes it feels like standing on a shoreline after a long swim, breathing hard, aware of how far the waters behind you stretch. I did not regret my choice to leave. I did not consider turning back. I simply continued forward, one step at a time, in a place that was finally my own. A few months passed, and the quiet distance I kept from the house allowed events to reach me only through the subtle conversations of neighbors and the inevitable traces left online. I learned that my sister had attempted to renovate the ADU beyond what the neighborhood association allowed, making changes that completely disregarded the regulations that every homeowner on the street understood they were bound to. The violation triggered a formal review by the HOA, which included fines, mandatory corrective work, and a public notice to her credit file. The financial pressure mounted until the consequences began to shape the rhythm of her daily life, affecting every application she filed and every lease she tried to negotiate. During the same stretch of time, the property that had once served as a point of pride for Patricia and Daniel became a burden of ongoing repairs. The rushed modifications inside the ADU had caused structural issues that required immediate attention, and the cost of the contractors fell directly onto them since there was no official rental agreement or transfer of responsibility. I did not reach out. I did not offer guidance or solutions. The situation unfolded without my involvement, as if the house itself was releasing a truth that words had failed to convey. Meanwhile, my studio continued to evolve into a space that reflected every lesson I had carried forward. I developed routines that supported both my work and my inner steadiness, allowing each day to feel grounded rather than uncertain. The laundry clients referred others, slowly turning occasional tasks into a steady schedule that enabled me to live without fear of losing stability again. I no longer waited for approval. I no longer measured myself by proximity to the family that had struggled to see me as someone with her own place in the world. I did not return to the house. I did not seek closure from anyone within it. My life moved in a direction that did not require their permission or apology. Growth sometimes comes from distances we never planned to create. I learned that leaving does not always mean abandoning love. It can mean protecting the parts of ourselves that have gone unheard for too long. Not every relationship finds a path back to harmony, and not every family chooses to understand. Yet moving forward with clarity allows us to build lives that reflect who we truly are, rather than who we were expected to be. Thank you for listening to my story until the end. Your time matters, and I do not take it for granted. If something within my experience resonated with you, I would like to hear your thoughts. Tell me where you are watching from and whether any part of this journey reminded you of your own. Your voice, your perspective, and your presence here truly matter.